Welcome back to another episode of Local Search Tuesdays. This week, I've got an exciting episode for you. I'm sharing the entire presentation from my closing keynote of LocalU in Denver last week. If you've never been, LocalU is the most epic of epic conferences. If you're watching this series, then local SEO matters to you, and that means you need to figure out a way to get to the next LocalU. It's kind of like if you got to go to a concert with the Beatles, Queen, Elton John, Nirvana, The Doors, Motley Crue, and Kiss, but also got to hang out backstage with the bands. So I'm here today to share my entire presentation, all about the crazy stuff I found by analyzing thousands of Google business profiles across 3 verticals: car dealers, lawyers, and cannabis dispensaries. This episode's a bit longer than usual, but it's worth it to hear about all the interesting tidbits I found. So kick back, let's get going.
Well, this is the scary truth about Google business profiles. What businesses really do. You know me because you're watching my video series, but if you haven't caught this before, I'm Greg Gifford, the Vice President of Search at SearchLab. I've got an awesome video series which you're watching right now, but make sure you go back and watch it every week on Tuesday. It's awesome. Quick tips, usually, but today's is longer because we're watching the whole video. But I'm lucky enough to get to speak at conferences all over the world, and a lot of times you see some presenters at some of these conferences that aren't so great. They've stand locked behind the podium with their back to the crowd because they're reading their own slides, and the background of the slide is just plain white with black Arial font and tons of bullet points. And because of that, I firmly believe that bullet points kill kittens. So today's presentation will be entirely kitten safe. And there's always a movie theme. You guys know that. You've been watching the videos for a while. Today's theme is horror movies. We've got at least one horror movie for every year in the last 50 years. We've actually got 82 total horror movies. And for the more obscure stuff, there is attribution over to the side. So not only will you learn some awesome stuff about Google business profiles, you'll have a kick-ass list of movies to go watch later. So let's kick it off. And if you're a little worried about the horror theme, trust me, the scariest thing you're going to see today is some of the 80s fashion that they had in some of these horror movies. But let's get going. Why the long face? Do you need a hand with your Google business profile and trying to get better visibility? Lucky for you, I've got several to spare. I know a lot of times when you're trying to figure out why you're showing up or why a competitor is showing up better than you feel like you're going to lose your head. But I'm here today to kind of give you some more insight into what people actually do. We're not talking about best practices. We're talking about real world data. And hopefully this will help you understand what you need to do so you don't have to bend over backwards trying to figure out what to do. In fact, some of these numbers are going to rock your faces off. If you follow some of the advice I'm going to share with you today and look at what other people are actually doing in your vertical, you'll be able to show up better, so you'll be able to turn heads as well. Now, Mike Blumenthal said years ago that your Google business profile is your new homepage. And if we look at the most recent LaSurf study, we can see that big old chunk of green there shows that your Google My Business, or by the new name Google Business Profile, is the most influential factor for showing up in the map pack. And optimizing your Google business profile isn't really that difficult. You just got to cover the basics that most of us have been talking about for years and years. But today we're not going to rehash the basics. Today I'm going to show you what real world businesses actually do or actually don't do. So here's the methodology for this research project that I'm sharing data from. We used a tool called Places Scout, and we pulled data from 8,579 Google business profiles across 3 verticals. And with all the data points, that gave us 1.6 million data points across all of those. So here's how they broke down. We had 2,732 profiles for car dealers. We ran the keywords Ford dealer, Chevrolet dealer, Toyota dealer, Jeep dealer, Kia dealer, and used car dealer in all of the cities here. And then we looked at personal injury attorneys. We had 3,400 Google business profiles. We ran those 2 keywords in the same cities we ran the car dealerships in. We also checked out cannabis dispensaries, and there were over 2,500 profiles there. We ran dispensary, cannabis, and marijuana keywords in all of those cities, which coincidentally are cities in states where recreational cannabis consumption is legal. Now, the full study results will be released later this year on the SearchLab site. So you make sure to check back to see all the data. We're just now digging in and finding all the cool stuff. Now, there's obviously way too much to talk about in the 40 minutes that I had for the LocalU presentation. So today I'm going to hit the highlights for each vertical and do a little comparison so you get some insight into what's going on. So we're going to start off looking at the cannabis dispensaries. Local SEO is a massive opportunity for dispensaries because they're not allowed to do Google ads. So really, it's the only way they can be found. Recreational marijuana is booming in 19 states, and it's on the agenda to expand even further. So here are some of the high points of what we found. I hope you get that joke. There were 59 different primary categories across all of the profiles. 80% of them had cannabis store, and then it kind of dropped off, but you can see 2.2% just had store, which is the most generic thing possible. So people aren't paying enough attention to what they should be doing. 61% of all the profiles only had a single category selected. And if we're looking at the reviews, there were a total of 981,000 reviews across all of the profiles. The profiles averaged 380.1 reviews. And we know that UTM tracking is important to get correct attribution. Only 44.7% of the profiles had UTM tracking on their website link. And if we're looking at the Q&A section, the profiles averaged 10.7 questions in the Q&A section, which is pretty high. But of all of the questions asked across all of the profiles, only 1% of the questions had a primary answer from the business owner. And if we look across the last 12 months of time, 94% of the profiles had not published a single Google post. Pretty crazy. So let's look at the high points of the personal injury attorneys. Local SEO is really important for personal injury lawyers, and they tend to be really adept at local SEO and very aggressive with their strategies. So we expect to see a little bit better numbers here. So here are the highlights of what we saw. There were 28 different primary categories. 78% of them were personal injury attorney, but 8% just had law firm, 4.8% just had attorney. And look at that, 1.6% just had legal services, which makes zero sense. Only 30% of the profiles had selected just a single category. And if we're looking at reviews, there was a total of 51,000 reviews across all of the profiles, with an average of 74.2 reviews per profile. And only 21.9%, basically 22% of the profiles had UTM tracking on the website link. Very low number there. We had an average of 2.3 questions asked in the Q&A section. And if we're looking across the last 12 months, a little over half of the profiles had not published a single Google post. And then we're going to also look at car dealers, which if you've been following my videos at all, you know car dealers are near and dear to my heart because I've been in automotive for probably about 15 years now. And here's what we saw with the car dealers. Obviously, local SEO is really important for car dealers because people need to go into somewhere local to test drive that car before they buy it. And car dealers also get special rules and additional features in their Google business profiles that other businesses don't necessarily get. So when we look at the categories, there were 29 different primary categories, and these were a little bit more evenly split. But if you remember, we ran the keywords Ford dealer, Chevrolet dealer, Kia dealer, Toyota dealer, etc. So it makes more sense that there's going to be a more even split among the categories selected as primary categories. But 27.4% of the profiles only had one category selected. And here's the crazy thing. There were over 2.7 million reviews across these car dealer profiles. And if you're doing quick math in your head, you're right. That's an average of almost 1,000 reviews per profile. So significantly more reviews. And a little over half of the profiles had UTM tracking on the website link. And when we're looking at the Q&A section, there was an average of 6.2 questions asked in the Q&A section of each profile. And across the last 12 months of time, 54% of the profiles did not publish a single Google post. And only 57.8% of the profiles had separate department Google business profiles. Now, car dealers are allowed to do things that other businesses aren't. They're allowed to have a separate Google business profile for their parts department and their service department, even though technically it's all the same business and they don't have the separate entrance and separate signage that is typically a requirement for Google Business Profiles. It helps dealers show up much better for the different business centers they have. But as you can see, only a little bit more than half of the profiles have those set up. And another feature that got rolled out about a year ago is something called Cars for Sale. It allows dealers to have a live inventory feed displayed in their Google Business Profile. So it's almost like a Google shopping feed, but it's the actual inventory of the dealership displayed in the Google Business Profile. It's called Cars for Sale. And 70% of the profiles had it, which means 30% didn't, and they absolutely could. So that's a little bit of a shocker. But now we want to move on to some of the fun stuff. In person, I had everybody either put their hand up, stand up, or stay seated to vote for which vertical they thought had the most photos. Now, obviously, it's a little bit tougher to do this on video, but just in your head, think whether you think dispensaries or personal injury attorneys or car dealers had the profile across the 8,000 plus profiles that had the most photos of any profile. The lawyer that had the most photos had 4,400 photos. The dispensary that had the most photos had 6,075. And the car dealership with the most photos, there was one profile that had 15,879 photos for one profile. And then, even though we know that questions don't have an influence on ranking, it was cool to look for patterns. And here was another thing we wanted to look at and do the little voting thing in person. Again, keep in your head which vertical you think is going to have the most questions in their profile, whether it's a dispensary, an attorney, or a car dealer. The car dealer that had the most questions had 108. The attorney that had the most questions had 170. And the profile that had the most questions across everything that we looked at was a dispensary that had 303 questions. And then obviously we know reviews are important. So same thing, keep it in your head. Which one do you think is going to win? Dispensaries, attorneys, or car dealers? The profile that had the most reviews for a personal injury attorney was 10,016. Across car dealers, the profile that had the most reviews was a dealership that had 20,620 reviews. But there was a dispensary, one single location, that had 28,145 reviews, which is pretty nutty. And I don't know about you, but I would bet a significant number of those are probably fake. And then I can also filter by position because we were looking at how these profiles ranked. We looked at positions 1 through 20 in the local finder. So 1 through 3 is going to be in the map pack, and then everything else is just below the map pack in the local finder. And we found some interesting stuff. The average number of photos per ranking position. Dispensaries, the number 1 position had 110. The number 10 position had 106. The number 20 position had 39. For personal injury attorneys, the number 1 position had 174. The number 10 had 80. And number 20 had 111. Kind of went up at the bottom, a little strange. Car dealers, number 1 had 726. Number 10 had 366. And then number 20, 537. Went up again. But notice all of the number 1s had more than what the average was. And then what about questions? Again, not a ranking factor, but still something interesting to look at. Average questions per ranking position. Dispensaries had 19.8 questions for number 1, 6.1 for number 10, and 1.5 for number 20. PI attorneys, not quite as big of a swing there with 4 for number 1, 2 for number 10, and 3 for number 20. And car dealers went in completely the opposite direction of what we'd expect with 3.6 for number 1, 7.9 for number 10, and 9.6 for number 20. So it actually had more questions the lower the visibility was. And then looking at how many Google posts happened in the last year per ranking position. Dispensaries, 2.3 for number 1, 3.9 for number 10, and 6.2 for number 20. So the lower they ranked, the more often they were doing posts to try to get a little bit of an edge on visibility, even though posting doesn't really influence ranking, could potentially help you stand out a bit. PI attorneys, 31.7 at number 1, 19.6 at number 10, 15.6 at number 20. Nothing surprising there. Car dealers also opposite direction, 31 for number 1, 37.4 for number 10, and 39.4 for number 20. So same thing as dispensaries. You're not as visible. You're doing a little bit more to try to stand out. And then looking at average review count per ranking position. For dispensaries, 565.9 for number 1, 227 for number 10, and 71 for number 20. Totally what we would expect. For PI attorneys, 163 for number 1, 57 for number 10, 47 for number 20. Totally what we would expect. And once again, the car dealers screwed it up and did something totally unexpected with 357 for number 1, 1,059 for number 10, and 1,400 for number 20. But also notice the average number per profile is 979, yet the ones that ranked number 1 averaged 357. Pretty crazy. Again, seems like the guys that don't show up as well are doing everything that they can to try to boost visibility. And then average rating per ranking position, nothing really that exciting here, but interesting to show. Anyway, dispensaries, 4.5 for number 1, 4 for number 10, 3 for number 20. Okay, nothing crazy there. Lawyers, basically the same thing, 4.8 for number 1 and number 10, and 4.9 for number 20. Car dealers, same thing, 4.3 for number 1 and 4.4 for number 10 and number 20. So no big swings there. But if we break down the average number of positive reviews per ranking position, again, we see the heavier on the top pattern with dispensaries with 83.5 at number 1, 74.4 at number 10, and 55.8 at number 20. Same thing with attorneys, 91.5 for number 1, 84.9 for number 10, and 74.8 for number 20. But then car dealers bucked that trend with 79.9 at number 1 and a higher 83.6 for number 10, and higher than number 1 but lower than number 10 at 81.6 for number 20. So kind of weird there for car dealers again. And then looking at schema, because we know having schema on your Google Business Profile landing page is an important factor. So how does that work out? With dispensaries, exactly what we'd expect. The guys at number 1 had the most. The guys at number 10 had less. The guys at number 20 had a lot less. For attorneys, number 1 had 52.7, but number 10 had 64.2, and number 20 had 56.5. No sense there. Car dealers, 51.5, then dropping off to 48.7, then jumping way back up to 55 at number 20. But important caveat on the automotive side, the largest automotive website provider typically does not include schema. You have to actively do SEO and add it in yourself. Does not come with schema out of the box like every other automotive platform does. So that's why it's a little bit wonky there on the automotive side. And then if we're looking at word count for Google Business Profile landing page, now we look at non-stop words, meaning no, the, and, of, a, things like that. So for dispensaries, pretty much what we'd expect. The number 1 has more words on it. Number 10, fewer. Number 20, a little bit more, but still fewer. Attorneys, weird trend. 899 for number 1, 835 for number 10, but then over 1,000 for number 20. And car dealers, again, completely opposite what we would expect. 625 for number 1, 921 for number 10, 803 for number 20. So, like I said, we just really started digging in. We've really just been able to identify a couple of quick, easy patterns that jump out. So what are those correlations? Basically, if you're a dispensary and you're going to rank better, you're going to have more than the average of those averages I listed earlier. So better than most of the competitors. Same thing with PI attorneys. You got to be more than average to do well. With car dealers, it's not as much about Google Business Profile. It's a lot more about what brand you're selling and the content that's on your site. So this is something we had to cross-reference a lot of data to start figuring out. It's going to be released in the results of the full study this fall. Now, I burned through that really fast because I knew you guys are watching this online and I didn't want to bury you in all the anecdotes and other things that I mentioned live. So thanks so much for taking that crazy roller coaster ride with me. Now, when you're looking at how you're ranking in Google Business Profile and the map pack, you won't be so much of a basket case. And hopefully I've opened your eyes to the power of pulling real world data to see what's working. So hopefully now you've got a little bit more of the key to succeed so that your profile will have more of a hook. So people will like it, you'll show up better, and you'll be able to break out of your shell and do better optimization so that you and your customers and your clients will be happy. That was the scary truth about Google Business Profiles, what businesses really do. There's my email address. I have an open email policy. Feel free to email me any questions you might have. I will always answer emails. And if you'd like to get the slides, you can email me. I'll shoot them over to you. And at the end, as always, there's a list of all the movies by order of release date. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks so much for watching the whole presentation. Make sure you check back next week. I'll be sharing local SEO tips from the speakers and experts at LocalU. But for now, that's definitely all the time we've got left for this week's episode. So you know what that means. Put your hand on the screen right here. We totally just high-fived because you learned something awesome. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of Local Search Tuesdays.